Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World. On Fridays, I like to ramble along about various things that I'm thinking about, and today is Shameless Self-Promotion Day. I have a book called The Genesis Option, which is being published in England and also available free on the internet by Sean Kingston Publishing. I will certainly let you know when it's available. Right now I'm finishing the edit based on a reviewer's comments, and I just finished the edit. So, woohoo! That is work I absolutely hate. And the worst part is checking the bibliographic references, which I despise intensely. But I'm done. So now I'm going to talk about it. Let's get into it. Well, I'll probably talk about the Genesis option a lot in the next week or so, because it is very much part of my whole biblical analysis, and I've touched on those issues before and I will touch on them again. The Genesis option essentially argues that the book of Genesis reached its final form during the period known as the Babylonian exile or the Babylonian captivity at the beginning of the 6th century BCE, when the people of Judea, that is the community around Jerusalem, were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar of the Neo-Babylonian Empire for various reasons. I won't get into all of that. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar came down on them like a ton of bricks, and he took all of the upper echelons, the priests, the scribes, the scholars, historians, nobility, wealthy, what have you. He just carted them all off to Babylon because they were being too rebellious in Jerusalem. And they were stuck there for a generation. And in a lot of ways, that exile and captivity were defining moments for Judeans who became Jews in modern terminology. The Hebrew and Aramaic words for Judean are Yehudi and Yehudai, which get eventually mangled by Greek and Latin authors and eventually through French into English as Jew. So it's really about how Jews originally defined themselves both ethnically and religiously. It's a very interesting period, because when I was an undergraduate studying the history of Israel and Judah in the 1970s, we pretty much accepted the histories from the book of Samuel and the book of Kings as like pretty much definitive. And then archaeology in the 80s and 90s came along and just overturned that apple cart completely. People like Amahai Mazar and William Dever and Israel Finkelstein said, wait a minute, you could not have had this glorious kingdom of Israel and Judah in the 10th century BCE because the archaeology just doesn't support it. What it says is that Jerusalem and the surrounding area of Judah at that time was just a bunch of small villages. Even Jerusalem was just tiny. It can't have been this great kingdom. There's something wrong here. And so there's been a huge revisionist history, and now the consensus is moving towards the idea that the Babylonian period, the captivity or the exile, was the real defining moment. Well, I'm going to leave all of that aside for the moment, and I'm going to just point to the final chapter of Genesis Option, because I just edited it again, and it has one major point. See, the thing is that how an ethnic group is defined is really important. And the question is it going to be defined by outsiders, or is it going to be defined inside the ethnic community? And going back all the way to people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Hannah Arendt and numerous other scholars, has been the notion that if you let others define you, you lose. And so one of the big questions that was raised at the foundation of Israel was, who is a Jew? Now, Adolf Hitler defined Jews, Joseph Stalin defined who Jews were, but that's outsiders defining who Jews are. The state of Israel asked the question itself, and that's a very important transition from having others define who you are to defining yourself. All right, that's the Genesis option. For the moment, I'm going to leave that aside, and I'm going to take a much more personal view of the Genesis option. That is, who are you? Now, you have two choices, just like in the Genesis option. Do you want outsiders to define who you are? Or do you want to define who you are? Now, I'll take a really, really, really personal view and say that for almost all of my life, I let others define who I am. Now, I define who I am. And I'm not going to pay attention to what other people think of me or care about what they say about me. I mean, I care what they say about my books because they're not going to get published if they hate them, or if they get reviewed badly, they're not going to sell well. I mean, we do have to confront the opinion of the outside world in a lot of ways. But the key way is how you define yourself. Do you find yourself in terms of your home country, where you were born, your ethnicity, all those kinds of things? How do you define yourself? Is it in terms of outsider views, or is it in terms of who you are inside? Now, one of the things I really, really love is that for a long time I really didn't know who I was, because my family took me all over the world. I was born in Buenos Aires, so I am legally and officially Argentino. And my official, actual name on my birth certificate is Juan Alejandro. But my mother, an outsider, said, "You are not Juan Alejandro. You are John Alexander. You are English, and you have to remember that." My father, on the other hand, liked to think that I was Scottish. He was from Glasgow, from a family that ultimately came from the Shetland Islands, and he wanted to find me as Scottish. So occasionally, one of my sisters will tell me, right now you have to be the Canny wee Scot. And And I think, yeah, I guess I have to be. But that's governments, that's family defining who I am. I returned to Argentina 10 years ago after I retired as a professor because I wanted to figure out who I am independent of those things. And I decided through various means and over long discussions and whatnot that I am Juan Alejandro. And that's who I want to be, and that's what I want people to call me. And I have certain expectations coming from inside. Now, when that matured, I was given a nickname in Buenos Aires. In Buenos Aires, they don't like to use diminutives. You'll occasionally hear Eva Perón spoken of as Evita, and there's a certain political necessity to that, that when you use the diminutive ita or ito, you're being very, very, very intimate. People don't use diminutives publicly. They use them within the family, and that's about it. If you use a person's diminutive in public, you're going to get yelled at. And you can ask me how I know that. I have a diminutive. You can't use it. Nobody can use it except the people who I allow to use it. On the other hand, though we don't call people the equivalent of Mike, Dave, etc., we do use nicknames and use them all the time. And sometimes they're ironic. You know, for example, if somebody's really fat, we might call them flaco, which means skinny. But we'll constantly call people gordito or gordita, you know, like chubby. And there's no offense taken, which I think is rather surprising. For a long time, I was called Gitano, the gypsy. And that, you know, that seems fair enough. But then they struck on Zorro. And Zorro is a very interesting term. It means the fox. And of course, you know Zorro from the masked guy, you know, riding around like Robin Hood. Not that. I was called Zorro because the fox does what he wants. He eats where he wants, he sleeps where he wants, he travels where he wants, he goes where he wants, he does what he wants. He's his own person. And that to me was a defining moment because you know, I'm not going to call myself Zorro to anybody else. You can use it if you like, although Gitano is probably better in a lot of ways. But it helped me define myself in my own terms and not in terms of what other people think of me or expect me to do. So there's today's lesson or challenge, maybe. What do you want to be? Do you want to be defined by others, or do you want to be defined in your own terms? It's a very, very hard question to answer, and I suspect that most people either don't want to accept the challenge or can't answer it honestly. You see, the thing about defining yourself in terms of your own identity is that you have to engage in honest self-analysis. And most people are either incapable of doing that or don't want to do it. I'm reminded of one of the things that Donald Trump said very early on in his presidency, which I think was extraordinarily telling. Somebody asked him some question about whether he ever examined himself. And he said essentially, No, because I'm scared to look. Well, that's hardly surprising. But it's not unique to Donald Trump. Most people are scared to look inside themselves because they're scared of what they'll find. That was Sigmund Freud's whole point, that looking inside yourself is very difficult and you're likely to put up your own defense mechanisms. That's why he suggested that after he had analyzed himself and came to all of his conclusions that he came to, that he didn't recommend other people doing it, but rather recommended that they use a therapist to do it, because the therapist was likely to be more open and impartial and would get deeper than the individual would get. Well, I'm, a moderate fan of Freud. I don't like a lot of his theories, but I'm not sure particularly about that one. I don't think that therapy is necessarily the best avenue, although it may be for many, many people who are not capable of being honest with themselves. But it's also true that outsiders have their own agendas. And if you go to a therapist, you're allowing an outsider to define you. If you dig inside yourself, by yourself, with honesty and openness, you might get deeper. I don't know. I'm opening it up to you as your challenge of the week. And if you like this, tell your friends, like and subscribe, and I'll get deeper into the Genesis option next time. Have a good week.